I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have a few more people coming in. Phelps Theater is hard to find if you haven't been here before. It's kind of like a maze, working your way down through the rec center or going through the back entrance. But thank you for coming today. I'm Chad Stebbins from the Institute of International Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker all the way from Prague in the Czech Republic, Dr. Francesca Shermova. She's an associate professor at the Department of Anglophone Literatures and Cultures at the Faculty of Education, University of Hradec Králové. The University of Hradec Králové is our partner university in the Czech Republic. We exchange students every semester, and now we're starting to do some faculty exchanges. Very exciting. Dr. Shermova received her PhD from Charles University in Prague with an award-winning dissertation on African-American poets in Czechoslovakia. She was a Fulbright scholar at the Davis Center of Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University in 2017-2018. More recently, she was a fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna and a visiting researcher at Northumberland University, Newcastle, working on her upcoming monograph titled Prague, Red and Black, Early Cold War Journeys, Networks, and Poems. Her research focuses on Cold War racial imaginaries and discourses and translation issues in a broader sense. As an American studies scholar, she is also interested in ways to approach this field transnationally and how to discuss U.S.-related issues with Czech students and vice versa. So please join me in giving a warm Missouri Southern welcome to Dr. Shermova.
Thank you so much, Chat, for the introduction, and thanks generally for having me. I was thrilled to have this opportunity to talk to you, and also I visited Missouri once. Sadly, it was only Kansas City that I've been to, but I really wanted to visit again, and it's nice to be there with you, at least in spirit, in this way. And again, well done on finding the room. I was told that it's really not that easy, so well done on being here with me today. And again, I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you for a bit. Okay, the title of my talk is The Czechoslovak Connection, Spies, Translators, and African American Poets in Cold War Prague. And I hope all of these parts will be explained later on. But I just realized one important information that is not a part of the talk, and that is the Czechoslovak part. So just for a quick clarification, Czechoslovak, it is funny putting together two now independent nations, Czechia and Slovakia, used to be together from 1918 to 1993, and then it split again and became Czechia and Slovakia, but it was Czechoslovakia at the time that I'm going to talk about. So just a short clarification so that it's clear where this term comes from. Okay. Let's start with the Cold War part then. And I'm going to start with the very non-Cold War-like picture, because we usually don't associate Baroque architecture with this 20th century conflict. But the picture that I'm showing you is a picture of a Clementinum Library, it's called, in Prague. If you ever get the chance to visit the city, I would really recommend to go there. It has wonderful study halls as well, where you can study. Anyone can come in and take their book with them and study. Sadly, it's not this particular hall, but this one is the most photogenic. That's why I chose it. And this is actually where the story, our story today, starts. And it starts a bit egocentrically with me finding a book, and usually in literature, and also the history of literature, it always or usually starts with a book, and this is exactly how it starts today. The book in question is a book from 1958. It's called, the title translated to English is Black Poetry, World Anthology. And it is an anthology of poetry from the whole Black diaspora. So African-American poets, but also Black poets from the Caribbean, from Brazil, from various African countries as well. So a whole range of poems by various poets put together in one book. And in order to understand this cultural artifact, we'll have to look at the time when it was, put together, and that is 1958. So what's happening in 1958? Three super important processes that are both interconnected and crucial for this particular artifact, and that is decolonization, so the process of kind of gaining independence of former colonies, then the early civil rights movement, again very important for this, and then obviously the Cold War. So three very important contexts, interconnected. If you are interested more in this interconnectedness, because great scholarly work has been done on how these processes, how these things kind of are linked together, I would recommend looking at the books that I have listed at the bottom of the page. And sometimes I kind of insert these little notes because those are fascinating topics that we don't really have the time to go in. But again, if you are interested in further reading, please note them down and follow that trace. I think that it is really great scholarly work that it's been done on precisely these topics that I'm talking about. So as I said, decolonization, early civil rights movement, and the Cold War. So in that context, it's probably not surprising that the anthology is framed by its editor as a gesture of solidarity. And he says that it is a little Czechoslovak contribution to the anti-imperial, anti-racist, and anti-colonial struggle. So this is how he frames the anthology. I was looking at this anthology because I noticed that there is a surprising number of African-American poets that were translated from English to Czech in the 1950s and then early 1960s as well. And the received narrative is that these poets were translated because they were so critical towards the racial relations in the US. And again, another important context that ties in with the Cold War topic is that in 1958 in Czechoslovakia, what we have is that the Communist Party has been, the one-party rule period has been going on for 10 years already. So the Communist Party took over in Czechoslovakia shortly after World War II in 1948. Yes, 48, no, yeah. So this one party took over the power, and then again, publishing politics changed, and you have various ways of censorship and of publishing politics and cultural politics. But so this is in place for 10 years already when this anthology is published. And because these poets were so critical towards the US governmental policies, the received narrative says this is why they were published, because obviously at the time we also have a pretty strong anti-US propaganda. I was interested in what's actually behind this narrative and whether maybe there was something more than just propaganda. And unsurprisingly, yes, the story is always a bit more complex than we think. And this is actually one of those stories behind what's more there than the propaganda. Why? Interestingly enough, when I was looking at the book, again, imagine this beautiful study hall at this beautiful library in historic Prague, I noticed this little note that said that the introduction to this anthology has been translated by somebody. And I was really curious because the name of the editor was Čapek, and I will just skip to the next slide. Čapek is such a typically Czech name. It is a name that has the ch, this weird sign above the C letter. It's a totally normal surname, Czech surname. It's also a name of a Czech writer, Karel Čapek, who gave the world the word robot, which I'm sure that either you heard it already during the Czech semester lecture series, or you might hear it yet because it is our big, contribution to the world, and we're very proud of it. So the world robot, a different Čapek, but still, so pretty common Czech name. I would have expected perhaps there is some link between these two Čapeks, but no, this introduction has been translated. So why would somebody with such a typical Czech name need a translation? And from what? So this is how I found out that the name Čapek actually was a name under which there was a US communist hiding in Prague, Abraham Chapman. He was hiding there, and I used the word hiding intentionally, we'll see why, between 1951 and 1963. So this is our first part, a kind of thrilling hidden identity. So we have somebody whose name was Abraham Chapman, but he was actually posing as Čapek in Czechoslovakia. And again, I always found it a bit funny that he chose this name, because when you say it out loud, it's kind of similar. But if you look at it at a page, I think you would not really recognize the similarity as much as when you say it. So I guess then it is a good secret name then. This story actually has been told, or we know part of Chapman/Čapek story already, because he moved to Czechoslovakia with his whole family, so his wife and his two daughters. And one of these daughters, Kimmich, wrote a memoir about her time in Czechoslovakia. It was published by Georgia University Press in 1997, I think. And if you are interested in 1950s history and also the so-called red diaper narratives, so narratives of children of communist functionaries, I would heartily recommend this, because it's such an interesting story of how she, as a little girl, was kind of forcibly had to move from New York, where she grew up, to Cold War Prague, or how different everything was for her, how she struggled with the language, and then slowly how she adjusted to the customs, and how she kind of became Czech, only to have to go back again when she grew up. So kind of really interesting story of coming of age in Cold War Prague. Again, recommended. The subtitle reads "A Young Woman's Secret Life Behind the Iron Curtain," and this is precisely what it is. But Kimmich's book is not a book of history. It is a personal memoir of what happened to her in Prague, and she does mention her father, because he's the reason why they came, but she doesn't. It's not a book centered on her father. So that's kind of, it's not a historical source per se, and there is a lot of things that she omits. We don't really know for what reasons, but there is a lot of things that she just doesn't cover in her book, in her memoir. So I was slowly putting together pieces to find out more about this mysterious Abraham Chapman, and these pieces were hiding in various archives in the Czech Republic, in the US. They were hiding in various correspondences, in books, in reports, all sorts of materials. And this is actually what I put together, and what we know about this person who came to Cold War Prague and stayed for over a decade and then left again. So he was born in Chicago in 1915, married. His wife, Belle Chapman, also came with him to Prague. He joined the Communist Party of the US sometime in the 1930s. He was quite active there. He also, and in the framework of the party, he also befriended various African-American cultural figures that were interested in the party at the time, such as Richard Wright. If you know a bit about Richard Wright's story, he later famously kind of parted ways with the Communist Party and was very vocal in his critique of the party and the party system and its politics, and especially its politics towards African Americans. But at the time, 1930s, 1940s, they were still friends, corresponded. We have that correspondence, and it is a fascinating story on its own. But back to Chapman, he was also active as a journalist for various communist papers. And as a result of these activities, he was then summoned before the subcommittee to investigate the administration of the Internal Security Act and other internal security laws of the Committee on the Judiciary United States Senate. Always takes me a while to read out loud, I'm sorry. But to give you context, this was one of the committees that was supposed to investigate about the communist infiltration in US governmental and cultural structures. So we probably heard about the McCarthy committee, but there were more of these committees that kind of rose from the same spirit of partly an anti-communist hysteria, but also a spy paranoia that was present on both sides of the Iron Curtain in the 1950s. But Chapman, instead of actually going, he never actually appeared in front of the committee because he secretly left the country in 1950 via Mexico, and then he appeared in Prague in January 1951 with his whole family and lived there up until 1963. What did he do in Prague? He obtained a degree in US literature at Charles University, Prague. He taught US literature, published articles on especially African-American literature. Chapman himself was an African-American, but he had all of these histories with particular cultural figures, and that's what he brought to Prague and was able to kind of mediate that to the Czechoslovak readership. So he published articles, edited texts such as the anthology that I have shown you, and again taught as well. Interestingly enough, during that time, he also went to China. He was there between 1959 and 1960. At that time, you could not get to China as a US citizen. He went there as a Czechoslovak citizen, which is what he legally was during his time in Prague. So if you were looking for Abed Čapek, his Czech name, you would find a Czechoslovak citizen, not a US one. He then went back to the US in 1963, became a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, continued to publish on various topics connected to African-American literature, and was also very active in trying to implement African-American literature in high school curricula, university curricula as well. He put together other anthologies, for example, Black Voices in 1968, and then New Black Voices a couple of years later, and was very active also in the field that was then called ethnic literatures. So he put together an anthology of Native American writing and Jewish American writing, and a couple of books like that. And then he died in 1976. So those are the facts. But as if you have ever worked with history or generally sources, we know that sources are notoriously unreliable. Archival materials can lie as well. And again, we can't really rely on anything. Interestingly enough, if you look at Czech sources, the only thing that you will find is what I've mentioned here, like this little pink part in the middle. We have this Abed Čapek who emerged out of nowhere, was dedicated to spreading US literature in Czechoslovakia, especially African-American literature, and then vanished again. If we look at US sources, we will not find any mention of his time in Czechoslovakia. So it's like there would be two separate figures, one called Čapek and one called Chapman, and it's very hard to kind of form a coherent story out of these two, these sources. There is Čapek has his files. Sorry, Chapman's files are at Brown University. You can find some of his manuscripts and letters, etc. And it's funny that looking at those archival files, you could have never guessed that he ever left the U.S. There's one mention in a sort of a celebratory speech that somebody else was giving on his, to honor Chapman at one occasion, and that speech mentions that Chapman got his PhD or his doctorate in U.S. literature in Prague, and the speaker makes it sound as if Chapman only went to Prague in order to get his education in US literature. So that's kind of, again, shows us that sources are unreliable, and that it kind of helps to look at things in a transnational way in order to uncover more of that story. So why did Chapman go to Czechoslovakia in the first place? We have this version of him getting a degree in U.S. literature there, but I think that's kind of this theory doesn't really hold that much. But I have 4 different scenarios that I will introduce to you, and you can form your own judgment. So scenario or theory number 1: Chapman could have been a U.S. spy sent to Czechoslovakia at the time. This is what the contemporary, the spy paranoia of the time would like to believe, because there were actually processes and constructed processes with U.S. spies that frequently had anti-Semitic undertones as well, and it's kind of one of them was Slansky trial that I put on this little note below. So it's kind of lucky that Chapman escaped those, because there was this, again, atmosphere of paranoia. Foreigners coming in were seen with great suspicion because they could have been US spies. But apart from the paranoia, we don't really have any evidence that would support this theory. And generally, it doesn't really ally with Chapman's politics either. Option number 2, the Chapmans went to Czechoslovakia for ideological and economic reasons. This might sound surprising today, but it wasn't so much at that time. There were actually families that were coming from, especially the US. There weren't that many, but there were a few families that came from the US for that very reason. It's also because, again, we're finding ourselves at the beginning of the 1950s. So that means before the violent suppression of the revolution in Hungary in '56, before Khrushchev revelations of Stalin's crimes. So much of what was happening in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc was still unknown to US communists and US radical leftists. So sometimes they honestly believe that what is happening in these new socialist countries was actually fulfilling the promise of communism. So they wanted to go and see it for themselves. So this could have been a reason. Interestingly enough, why would then Chapman need to adapt a new name and Czechoslovak citizenship? In other cases of these families that came, they usually came, stayed for a couple of years, were disappointed, and then left again. They kept their name, they kept their citizenship. So it just doesn't ally. But again, it's a possibility. Scenario number 3, and we're getting to the more probable ones, was that Chapman, who was an important member of the Communist Party of the US, was sent to Czechoslovakia to be kept safe. At that time, where these, high-up communist functionaries would be sent to prisons or otherwise, punished, it was a policy of the Communist Party of the US to send people abroad. They were called deep freeze cadres. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So you kind of like froze these people so they could then come back and help to rebuild the party, because so much of its members would have been imprisoned. So this is definitely a possibility. And again, Prague would be much better choice than Moscow, because Moscow was too on the nose. So frequently Prague or similar cities, Warsaw, Berlin, would be used for these purposes because it was less obvious than sending these people to Moscow. What speaks against this version is that Chapmans were not treated as well as other communist functionaries. From the archives, we have a lot of complaints that they complain about their living situation, which was an ideal job situation, especially for Chapman's wife. So a lot of complaints. And if there were really these, important communist functionaries sent abroad, then they would have had a kind of preferential treatment, which they didn't. But again, it is a possibility, and it is a likely scenario. And the most kind of adventurous one is that Chapman was actually a Soviet spy during his time in the U.S., and the Soviet intelligence was afraid he would be discovered, and he would go to prison. And again, this was a time of, and I could have put this on there, and I regret I didn't, the Rosenberg trial, in which there were also people executed for being Soviet spies. So maybe they were afraid that he would he would be discovered and he would be put to prison. So this is why they decided to kind of, this is why they sent him to Prague. Actually, we don't know. We don't know the correct answer to this question just yet. I know for a fact that there is an FBI file on Chapman that has 400 pages, and I did apply to get it 3 years ago. The maximum waiting time is usually 2 years, but sadly, because of COVID, all of these things have slowed down substantially. So I don't have that file yet, but I really want to get my hands on that file. And I think once we have that file, we know much more about what he was actually, why he just decided to, out of nowhere, to kind of come to Czechoslovakia with his whole family, uproot his life, adopt a new name, sever all contacts with his family, and like change his life in such a big manner. So that was Chapman's story, which I find fascinating, but it's not even the most fascinating part of that. I think when we kind of zoom out a bit and think about what Chapman's story shows us and where does it lead us, it is a story of a political exile from the west to the east of the Iron Curtain, and that is a story that, at least us here in the Czech Republic, we don't hear that story that often. Usually we hear glorified stories about people who kind of left from the east to the west, but we seldomly hear these stories of people who like willingly came. That this story often kind of ends in a disappointment is a different thing, but it's interesting to see somebody who actually kind of moved in the opposite direction. It also shows us that culture travels in various ways. I told you that he brought his kind of cultural contacts with him. He was kind of intent on kind of popularizing US literature, especially African-American literature, in Czechoslovakia. So thanks to him, a lot of things translated. He also put together this anthology, etc., etc. So that's kind of unexpected that culture also travels to these people that we necessarily wouldn't associate with these travels. It also shows us the importance of mediators, such as Chapman himself. And it also points towards a broader story of African-American cultural figures in Czechoslovakia. And that is a story that doesn't start or end with the Cold War, but it transforms in the Cold War. So this is what I'm going to talk about in the second part of this lecture. I already mentioned the received narratives that African-American poets and writers in general were only published in Czechoslovakia and other Eastern countries as well, just because of a sort of anti-US propaganda. Looking at the archives, we can actually uncover real ties, both cultural and political. I'm going to talk about the culture a bit more, but just talking about the political, there were actually delegations that were sent to Eastern European countries. Usually those were radical leftist African-American writers and cultural figures. They were asking for financial support at times when they felt like they were being persecuted precisely because they were very critical towards US government in their early 1950s, which at that time was a dangerous act. So they were sending people over trying to get some support, both kind of moral and financial, from these new governments. Tragically, what they didn't know was that these governments were themselves oppressive, and A, and B, that they would not get any financial support whatsoever. But that is a different story. But then the cultural and moral support appeared in the form of publications, invitations. So there were real ties, and they didn't really go in a way that either of these sides would have imagined, but they were there. So it's not just a propaganda story. A second thing that it shows us is connected to this concept of the Black Atlantic. And again, there's this little, there's this little note, Paul Gilroy's notion of the Black Atlantic, and he looks at the culture of Black diaspora, how it kind of spread through the Atlantic, and how we can't really see African-American literature, for example, or African-American culture as isolated from all of these other parts. So what this shows is that maybe, this notion of the Black Atlantic could also include places like Czechoslovakia, but also the Soviet Union or cold Poland or East Germany, because there were also places where cultural contacts were forged, where we can also find texts that maybe we can't find elsewhere, and we'll be talking about that when I talk about Langston Hughes. And generally, whether we cannot take even a wider approach to analyzing African American and Black diaspora culture from these locations, from these very unexpected locations, actually. And one more thing, it also adds to the story of African American literature in the 1950s, because there is this narrative of a break, kind of rupture between 1930s, kind of very active, very kind of socially engaged, especially poetry, but also prose, and then that coming back in the 1960s. But we can see, thanks to these contacts and thanks to texts that were maybe published elsewhere, that actually these writers were publishing and were writing these socially engaged pieces of fiction as well, just, you know, because there wasn't a platform where they could publish it. Back in the US, they sometimes did send it over the Iron Curtain to their Eastern European or generally European publishers. To give you a very specific example, because I know I've been talking a bit, you know, abstractly, but to give you a great example of this is actually Langston Hughes, one of the, you know, most best-known African American poets. You probably know several poems by him, but actually so do we. I put a little archival, you know, a little letter that I found that was written by a cultural mediator, poet Kamil Bednář, from Prague to where Langston Hughes was at the time. And what Bednář says is, every educated person in our country knows the name of Langston Hughes. And actually, Bednář wasn't even, you know, over-exaggerating that much in the 1960s, because Hughes was hugely popular, widely published, translated and retranslated over and over. And I could spend another hour easily on talking about these translations, but I know our time is limited. But it's just fascinating to me. So what I said before is that, and if you look at the little pink part, Hughes actually was one of the poets that was criticized in the 1950s for his pro-Soviet poetry in the 1930s. But it wasn't just his pro-Soviet poetry, it was also his more explicitly political poetry, which resulted in one interesting occurrence. Hughes would send the poems that he knew couldn't be published in the US or would not be accepted well in the US directly to his European publishers. So we know about a couple of poems that he only sent to his Dutch publishers, but also probably they are waiting for us in the archives. And I think I have some, but I wasn't able to confirm that yet. There are more poems by Hughes that we don't necessarily know yet, but are hiding somewhere in Polish, German, Czech, Hungarian, or Russian translations. Which again, to think that these translations basically form an archive of Hughes's writing that wasn't captured as well. Again, that's a thrilling idea for me, and I hope that more research will be done in that direction. So Hughes was one of the people that was not only in relation to his Czech and Czechoslovak translators, but generally he was very active in mediating his own translations. He helped his translators a lot. We actually have at our disposal, by we, I mean the white scholarly community, there is a wonderful correspondence that he led with his Czechoslovak translator, Jiří Valja. And it's so precious because we can see in the way Hughes explained his poems to Valja, we kind of can see how he interpreted some of his poems, but also it's interesting to see what sort of stuff would a translator in the 1950s ask about. What sort of stuff would he have no idea about? And he's kind of explaining these concepts in his own words to his translator. So again, thrilling. So they did correspond about translations. but I also exchanged advice about other poets, especially poets from various African countries. So they would correspond, and they would also, write about other poets that they knew, other poets that they came across, poets that they translated, and that's again fascinating to me. Sadly, Hughes was invited several times, but never came to Czechoslovakia. He was also invited to a film festival. Pity that he couldn't come. I'm going to present two more little case studies. We still have time for that. But again, each of these would actually deserve their own lectures. I just thought it would be nice to give you a little show a little what I'm talking about in a more practical way. W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American sociologist, poet as well, thinker, and he's one of the people that actually is taught, I think, at U.S. high schools as well, U.S. universities, but also when I studied English and kind of American studies, obviously, then we covered a lot of his writings a lot because he was so influential for many other thinkers, and he was, such a prolific poet, etc. But actually, when we were learning about Du Bois at Charles University, little did we know that he actually received an honorary doctorate from the same university in 1958. Again, 1958, the year that the anthology that I was talking about was published. Coincidence. And so he got an honorary doctorate. For Du Bois in general, journeys were very important. He studied in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. But then he came again in the late 1950s, and he actually got an honorary doctorate in Berlin and then Budapest as well. So he had this kind of Eastern European tour. We have what there is at our disposal is his speech, where he talks about how glad he is that at a time where the more radical civil rights speakers were silenced, often because they were the ones associated with, not necessarily communist, but they were associated with the Communist Party. And so in time when they were silenced, that he is actually getting all these awards and honorary doctorates elsewhere. So and there's actually a video as well, and I didn't want to play it because I wasn't sure whether it's going to work or not. But I just put a little picture of that occasion there. Interestingly enough, I mentioned 1958, which brought us back to Chapman. But Chapman actually has met Du Bois before as Chapman when he was interviewing him in the 1940s in New York. And then he met Du Bois again in China. And I would be very curious what the two of them talked about and whether actually Du Bois then recognized Chapman when he saw him again in China as Czechoslovak citizen, as Chapman. But I don't know. It's hard to imagine, but again, it would be great to be there and kind of hear what these two people talked about and whether Du Bois recognized Chapman and what Chapman thought about that, because obviously he could not be recognized under his hidden identity. So that was Du Bois. And the last example that I have for you, and it's kind of sad that I'm only talking about three men. There were poets, female poets, women poets that were published as well, but sadly both the people that were published in the case and the people that were translating and mediating them were forming a sort of voice club. And I will talk about the gender aspect hopefully if I have more time, but it's just something to bear in mind and think about a bit more critically. Anyway, Paul Robeson, who in comparison to Hughes has visited Czechoslovakia, and he did so repeatedly. I think it was 6 or 7 times. And Robeson is kind of a problematic figure also in US historiography, meaning in thinking and writing history. Why is Robeson such a problematic figure? He started as this kind of golden star of, for example, the Harlem Renaissance. He was a lawyer who was also an excellent sports person. He was an actor and a singer. But soon he became a vocal supporter of the Soviet Union, and this is something that he did not call off up until his death in the 1970s. So again, this is one of the reasons why he's seen as so problematic, because we don't really know what to do with figures like that. The result is that this part of his story is sometimes erased, and what is kind of stressed is the period before he became, because his views became so pro-Soviet. But I think it's important to talk about the later period in his life as well. And I don't know if you have heard about Robeson, but I have I think that he is slowly kind of he was forgotten for a long time for these precise reasons, but I think he's slowly kind of getting back to a place which he deserves. So I'm glad to see that. Robeson was huge internationally. He was a global star. To such an extent that for Czechoslovak audience, he would be the one that would represent African-American music and US music in general. Again, this was partly because due to his views, he would be palatable for the Czechoslovak official structures. So he would go through the censorship system, and he could actually come and visit Czechoslovakia. He could sing. The picture that I'm showing you is a picture of a tribute, like one of his concerts. You can see that it was packed. I mean, I can see some empty chairs as well, but generally you can see that it was just packed with people. It was actually a sports stadium, so a huge concert, because he had such a huge audience, and his fan base is huge as well. And you can find in his archives, you can find that he actually got numerous letters from his fans from all over the world, because he really was such a world star. This is one part of the story. The other part of the story is that he was criticized by the Czechoslovak intelligentsia in the 1950s. And this was a generation of people that already grew up within the communist kind of rule, but they were critical towards the system. Sometimes it was an open critique, but kind of more undercover, suppressed critique towards the regime. And what they wanted to do was they really wanted to publish US novels. They really wanted to listen to US music, but they were allowed to do so only if it was certain number of pre-selected writers, and certain people, as Robeson, that were chosen as representatives of a whole genre. They were not interested in Robeson. They were interested in US jazz, and this was something that they loved and they really wanted to hear, but they couldn't because they already had Robeson, and Robeson was the one that was coming. So what we have is kind of an interesting dynamic in which Robeson is coming to Czechoslovakia. He comes with the solidarity message. He talks about the decolonization of Africa. He talks about a lot of topics like that. But then also he gets criticism by the kind of young intellectuals who say, it's great that Robeson is coming, but he's also talking about solidarity in times when our own poets are in jail, when people are imprisoned and murdered for their political views. So kind of an interesting dynamic there. Before we move on, I also wanted us to listen to a part of Robeson actually singing in Czech. He was such a multi-talented person. He was also a polyglot, so he could speak many languages, and he also learned Czech because he was supposed to star in a biographic movie about a Czech composer called Antonín Dvořák, who went to US for a part of his career. And he also met an African-American composer, and Robeson was supposed to play this composer. So this is why he learned Czech. And he also sung Dvořák's biblical songs in Czech. That movie was never made, but we do have the songs. So I just wanted us to listen to it, kind of get an idea what sort of a singer Robeson was, and maybe also why people that were really interested in jazz just couldn't be happy with only Robeson coming in.
Šíř čekal do babylonských, tam jsme se dávali a platávali. rozpomínajíce se na na verbi v těsni zavěšovali jsme citali se. A když se tam dotazovali nás ty, kteříž nás sajali na slova písničky.
Okay, I think that is enough, but I would definitely recommend you to go and listen to a bit more of Robeson. He has this wonderful style of singing, wonderful, unique voice. He was also one of the people that popularized the African American spiritual genre. So he sings a lot of famous spirituals. So again, very unique way of singing, but also something that didn't really fulfill the idea of jazz, something that the young Czech, kind of the young Czech intellectuals were interested in. No, sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. This is what I wanted to do. What I kind of started to talk about, but maybe put more to reiterate what I was talking about. For the new intelligentsia, these figures and Chapman, so these figures such as Robeson or Du Bois, represented the establishment. What do I mean by that? Because they were so officially supported by the hated communist structures, they were seen as part of them. Which also meant that oftentimes racism in the US was kind of seen as something that is pointed out by the communist structures, by the official structures. So it was seen only as an anti-US propaganda and not something that is actually happening to people. So these links that I mentioned, people coming to Prague or other places in the Eastern Bloc asking for support, was when we look at it from one perspective, it was these real links that were established or that they were trying to establish between Eastern Bloc countries and African American community, especially the radical leftist community. So those were real life links. But on the other hand, for these other people, it meant that there is this there is an association between the official communist structures that were oppressive with African American community. Official as I said, the racism was often, if somebody pointed out racism, it was seen as an anti-US propaganda, but also it was seen as a libation to the official structures, to the extent that if you really wanted to publish a US novel that would not normally go through censorship, you could write down in an introduction that it's actually a great anti-racist novel, or that the author kind of is active in the anti-racist cause, and that would kind of allow for the book to be published because pointing on racism in the US was such a strong theme, and it resonated so strongly in the contemporary discourse. But then again, it led to kind of emptying out of that, because it would be seen, if you mentioned racism or anti-racism, it would be seen as only, as I said, a libation to the official structures, and was not taken seriously. I mentioned the clashes over the story of African American and US culture because what people were interested in was jazz, and there's wonderful scholarship about Cold War jazz and the way how kind of jazz was smuggled to various countries. Again, I will recommend you to look at it. Just amazing. But again, it wasn't just jazz that was there, and I think it's important to look at these other stories as well. And what kind of I started to talk about and would like to point out now towards the end is that what we see now is a new generation of translators and culture mediators. So we're moving towards late 1950s and early 1960s, who, as I said, grew up already with this kind of criticism, inherent criticism towards the oppressive structures that they were living in, and were kind of striving towards a different culture that would not be associated with communism and the Communist Party. And sadly enough, a lot of cultural figures such as Du Bois or Robeson would kind of be the victims of being associated with these structures, which was why they were hugely popular at one time and then would be virtually forgotten later on in the later decades. Interestingly enough, this dynamics is again repeated when Angela Davis comes to the Eastern Bloc, famously in the 1970s, but that is a different story. To our story and to our new generation of translators and cultural mediators, a lot of interesting life stories there. One of them would be Jan Zabrana, which published his kind of immense diaries. It's like not several thousand pages, but maybe 1,200 pages long diary where he kind of chronicles his life as precisely this figure who is not openly against the regime, but kind of in secret, and how it kind of eats him from the inside. He was a great translator, also a great poet that could unfortunately not publish precisely for these political reasons, but he was allowed to translate. To be a translator in the 1950s, 1960s, I mean, I'm a translator as well, but I can't really imagine how it was like to sit in your little room and translate these words from English that you had no chance to speak with actual native speakers because there was such little contact, and find out about concepts and words that were so difficult to find in dictionaries or some old again dictionaries and books that were hard to reach. So where did those translators, what did they do? How did they do it when they wanted some information? Well, they went to a big library such as, and here we are again, Clementinum Library in Prague. And actually Zabrana was sitting in my favorite place as well. It's second row from behind. So if you ever get to visit that library, I would recommend to go to that particular study hall and go to the second row from behind, because it has these, it had Zabrana, this great translator, who is sitting there browsing through dictionaries, looking up various concepts from both African American poetry, but generally US literature more generally, because he did translate a lot of US literature, and he is considered one of the best, or the best translator from English to Czech. Who he also met one more person in that library, and this is something that he talks about in his diaries. These diaries, actually, there's an English edition coming out, but before that, I did recommend you a little article, Zabrana Overheard, that was published in Los Angeles Review of Books quite recently. I think it's a couple of months. So you can read a bit more about Zabrana there and also read some of his poetry. So Zabrana sat in that library. He was translating. He was writing his diaries that would become such an important artifact for us to remember, or to kind of picture what the communist era is like. So we have Zabrana sitting there, and somebody who was sitting just a row in front of him would be Václav Havel, a personality that is most notably connected to the end of the communist era, the Velvet Revolution that happened in 1989 in Czechoslovakia. And Václav Havel, this person who was, he actually was a writer as well. He then went on and became the first Czechoslovak and later Czech president, and is probably one of the most famous Czech personalities as well. And I'm sure that you will hear about him again in the course of the Czech semester. So as I said, we're back to where we started. And again, another recommendation for me, if you are in Prague, please go there, because it's such an important place for intellectual history. We are quickly coming towards the end of my talk. I would like to thank you for your attention, and please either have a question now, because we still have 15 minutes, or if you don't feel like asking now, please do use my email address. It's there. Ask me anything. I will be happy to provide more information or clarification about anything that maybe caught your interest. Thank you.
Are there questions for Dr. Shermova? Well, I have one. You presented the 4 theories about Chapman, but which one do you believe in?
I mean, I'm still thinking about this FBI file that has 400 pages, and I think there is something in there. Again, I would just be, yeah. I think there is more to come, and I think it's going to be more interesting than, yeah, I can imagine, actually. So I think there is definitely a spy element in there.
Have any books been written about Chapman?
Just a memoir of his daughter. That's it.
So that could be your next research project, right? A manuscript.
I mean, it's kind of it's my I mean upcoming or manuscript that I'm working on right now. But since I don't know whether this file or if the file is going to I think, yeah, maybe if it's interesting enough, I think it could be a fun. I mean, fun is a weird word in this context, but I think it could be a really interesting, maybe not necessarily nonfiction material, but definitely, definitely something that could be, yeah, kind of worked on further.
Questions from the audience? Well, one more question for you. Do you know where Langston Hughes was born?
No, actually, but you are going to tell me right now, right?
I'm going to tell you, in our city, Joplin, Missouri.
Oh.
1901. So the city of Joplin has never really capitalized much on that. His family left Joplin at a very early age. And they're trying to determine the location of where he was born. But I think he came back to Joplin one time, maybe in the 1950s for a quick visit. But born in Joplin. So that's our connection today.
Oh, thanks for telling me. And yeah, that's. I know that he went on and lived in Cleveland for a while because he met some people from the Czech and Polish minority there. But yeah, I didn't know about Joplin, and it kind of, for me, it kind of confirms that the world is always smaller than we think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for the presentation, and those in the audience, thank you for being so attentive. We will hopefully see you in Prague when a group visits in December.
That would be great. I look forward to it. And thanks again for your attention and for having me, and enjoy the rest of the Czech semester. I hope it goes wonderfully.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.